thanks again for coming to our talk today by Darren Byler, and the slide just disappeared. So we'll have a chance to hear his take on an important topic. It sounds like a new research project, but given the work that he's done already, as I'll talk about in a second, he seems eminently prepared to tackle this one. This is a lecture in a series sponsored by CERES, the Center for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, the Asian Institute, both at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, as well as the Belt and Road in Global Perspective research project, which is funded by SSHRC. And so we're really glad to have today Darren Byler. Darren is a sociocultural anthropologist at Simon Fraser University with an incredible CV. I encourage you to Google him. You can find it quite easily. He has 2 books so far. He's a pre-tenure professor, right, Darren? With 2 books to his name. The first is called Terror, Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession and Masculinity in a Chinese City, which is an important look at, and based on ground level field work, look at part of the world that unfortunately now is really hard to gain access to. And a second book from Columbia University Global Reports deals with some of the reasons why access to the field has become foreclosed. The book is called In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony, and it deals with some of the issues, the themes that will come up in today's talk, we suspect. Darren, does that sound about right?
Yeah, it'll reference it.
Okay, terrific. So we're really delighted that you could join us. The title of your talk is The Politics of Surveillance Infrastructure in the Economy of Global China, Origins, Capacities, and Adaptation. And Professor Byler will probably go for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and a discussion. So when the time comes, I'll signal to you all in the audience that you may put your questions into the Q&A. Okay, and there's a button at the bottom of your screen when the time comes. Okay, over to you, Darren. Thanks for joining us.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Ed. It's a real pleasure to be here. I guess you can all see that. This talk is a new talk. It's sort of based on my current research, which is looking more outside of China, a global China project, but is building on my previous work, which is on surveillance and internment, carceral systems, police and state power and corporate power in China, and particularly Northwest China. So you'll bear with me. This is a work in progress. It's sort of an experiment as a talk and as a research project. And it's also an experiment in thinking about global China as method, which is something that C.K. Lee or Qingquan Li, a sociologist from UCLA, talks about as ways of using the global China frame to think and to do research. And for me, what it means is thinking about how things that happen in China play out in global contexts. At the domestic policy, domestic development in China has an international component to it often, and the reverse as well. The things that are happening at the frontier of global China in places like Libya play back into how China is thinking about its own domestic politics and development. So in the talk, I'll talk through the rise of Chinese counterterrorism as a discourse and a theory and a set of technologies, and then travel with the ways that those technologies are now being deployed in other places in the world. Through safe city systems, counterterrorism technologies that are being built in many places around the world. And we'll arrive at a few broader implications through the talk. One of the things I'm trying to do in my current project is think about how these kinds of technologies produce different kinds of results and are intended to do different things. In some cases, it's about protecting geo-economic investment, Chinese investment. In other cases, it's about extraterritorial control, border control. It's also, in some cases, supporting anti-democratic governance in certain places. And in some cases, it's supporting democratic governance, but producing a Opticon effect, which is something I'll get into later on in the talk. Basically sorting populations and pushing some populations into the margins of the economy. I'll also end by thinking through how it plays out in soft power development related to China, with a discussion of the wolf warrior, and both the film and also the diplomacy that comes out of that framing of global China. Okay, and all along the way, a lot of this is really just driven by capitalism. The companies want to develop new technologies, they want investment. And so, if they're going to be paid, they'll build it. And so, that's underlying almost all of these different aspects of how security is deployed. Okay, so to start, I want to take you to Xinjiang, which is in Northwest China. In 2017, 2018, I was studying how a mass internment system there was being built as part of what the state called the People's War on Terror, targeting the Uyghurs. And I was seeing all of these, low-level state actors. These are like local political officials posting these things on their message boards online, talking about how what they were doing was preventing Xinjiang from becoming China's Libya. And I mean, they also said China's Syria at times, but China's Libya was the most common frame. And as I was reading that in 2017, it didn't really make sense to me because I just thought it was such an exaggeration. The Uyghurs weren't armed. They didn't really have a insurgency in any major form. And so it just seemed like a real exaggeration to think about the Uyghurs as potentially drawing Xinjiang into something that would resemble what had happened in Libya in 2011 and 12. But as I thought more about this, I went back to thinking about what did they mean when they said China's Libya, and what does Libya mean to China? And really what they were talking about was this moment in between 2006 and 2011 when China had entered Libya at a large scale as the UN had lifted sanctions, and as the Iraq war seemed to be on the wane. They had gone into Libya doing what global China does, which is get natural resources, often in exchange for infrastructure. So they're doing kind of a barter development project where they're building the infrastructure of a state while getting resources out of that space. And the infrastructure is to help support extraction of the resources, but also as a it's a win-win in the framing of the Chinese state for the receiving country. And so Libya had become the home of around 35,000 Chinese construction workers. Most of them were subcontracted to state-owned enterprises in Libya, and mostly building roads and pipelines and stuff like that. Then when Libya kind of fractured and turned towards a civil war, all of these Chinese folks that were living in Libya were stuck there. And so it mobilized a response from the state. They flew planes in from Xinjiang because that was the closest place to Libya. And they organized a sort of a system of transport to get Chinese people out of Libya. So it was an evacuation, 35,000 people. And it really dominated the news, at least for a few weeks or months. It's sort of similar to the way the evacuation of people from Afghanistan captured our attention last August. It did the same thing in China, and it was like the first sort of military action that the Chinese state had done to show showing its capacity, that it could protect its citizens. And it was also framed as a counterterrorism or an escape from terrorism kind of campaign, because Libyans are Muslim, and it seemed as though it was like the violence to them was being motivated by that Islamic difference. So that was an important moment in the discourse and framing of counterterrorism and the need for Chinese capacity to counter the threat of terrorism. This image here is showing the evacuation of the workers from Libya. There had been an earlier moment, the 2008 Olympics, and the need to securitize that. was also a major moment. But the Libya instance was the first that happened outside of China. In 2013 and 14, there were several other incidents, and this was domestic violence carried out by Uyghurs, also framed as terrorism by the state media. A SUV driven into a crowd of tourists in Tiananmen Square, and then an attack in Kunming at the train station with over 30 people killed. That was framed as China's 9/11, the 301 attack. And that is what precipitated the People's War on Terror in Xinjiang, the Uyghur region. And also a nationwide campaign to build counterinsurgency capacity or COIN, which meant mapping populations of potential terrorists, breaking up that social network, and then re-educating or winning their hearts and minds. And so they're really drawing on the Petraeus Doctrine, the US military approach to the occupation of Iraq, and then applying it to domestic space. The counterterrorism rhetoric and funding also was motivated by the rise of the Islamic State. A lot of it really just a response to the media circulating from the Islamic State. And that is part of what guided the approach to internment in Xinjiang, a kind of preventative policing, stopping people from being radicalized by nipping it in the bud, which is the police discourse on this. And is really borrowing from domestic counterterrorism in places like North America, where CVE programs, or countering violent extremism, have been in place. It's sort of, if you see something, say something, that kind of mentality, but in addition with data analytics. So you're actually looking at digital histories, social media and stuff like that, to decide if someone is potentially being radicalized. So, that's how counterterrorism arrived in China, in very broad strokes. And what it did in the Xinjiang region is it resulted in a digital enclosure system, a grid police system that was driven by state security, but also private industry, and was mobilized by 60,000 low-level police assistants that I refer to in my work as data police. An additional 30,000 regular police were also hired. It became one of the most densely policed places in the world. Initially, they wanted to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet because Uyghurs were using Uyghur language oral speech on WeChat and just Uyghur speech in general, which was difficult for the censorship system in China to control. But then it became more about enclosure, about stopping people from moving, and about predictive policing. It really became an incubator for private tech in China, particularly around computer vision and AI development. Some of the tools that were the most damaging when it came to their effects in Uyghur society were tools to automate transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech and imagery. And then another tool, and this is really what I'll focus on most in the rest of my talk, is tools to integrate data streams from cameras and checkpoints and all of that digital data that iFlyTech and MiaPico is collecting, integrate it into one system with one interface, and with a sort of cross-stream analytic. So it's analyzing all these different kinds of data and letting them speak to each other. So you build a more holistic portrait of the potential terrorist or population of terrorists. And, terrorists here should be in scare quotes because most of these people are not terrorists by any definition other than the system's definition. So, over time, what was built was this grid-style policing system that starts at the neighborhood level with a command center. There's also movement control, high-speed car plate recognition, which is something that we have in many contexts. We have them in North America as well. And then it was the data analytics tools, scanning people's phones, plugging them in, and you go through their digital history. And then collecting face recognition at checkpoints, and matching it to the GPS signal and the MAC address, the SIM card of the cell phone of the person that was going through the checkpoint. And so it's producing a system where people can be tracked in real time a kind of super panopticon, which means that systems are analyzing movement in real time, and you can search them and find them wherever they are, but you can also go back through time and see where they were yesterday and the day before. And the system itself is going to look for patterns in movement and alert police people watching the system to any sort of potential problems that is being predicted. So, this is what a typical checkpoint looked like in Xinjiang. And I'm pointing this out because I want you to pay attention to the brand. I don't know if you can see this very clearly or not over Zoom, but what it's saying is CETC on it, which is the China Electronics Technology Corporation, which is really one of the largest military contractors in China. And it's responsible for the integrated joint operations platform, the entire system that's integrating everything, and also the data doors and checkpoints here, which are, the data doors are the ones that are going to make sure that the person's phone is matched to the ID that's being scanned here, and then the image of the person's face that will appear here on this screen. So when I went through one of these checkpoints in 2018, I observed that there was a green lane here for people that appeared to be Han, which was just opened by the security workers, while Uyghurs have their face and ID scanned here and their phone scanned as they pass through this checkpoint. I went through the Uyghur line because I'm not either Han, non-Muslim, or Uyghur. And because I have a passport and not a state issued ID, I had to go into the police station and be scanned manually, which was also interesting. This is what the integrated joint operations platform interface sort of looks like. You can't see all of it here. This is an image from the internal police database, which I've analyzed as part of my book project. Hundreds of thousands of internal police documents that were obtained by the Intercept. And with many high resolution images like this that show sort of the capacities of the system, how it works. Although most of the information is more of the textual information that is in the police reports. But here it's saying the joint operations platform. And this person has been given an orange notice, which means that they are on a sort of intermediate watch list. They're not red. It's not a red notice. But it's not green either. And so this person is needing to be either taken in for interrogation or examined more closely. So that's the system in Xinjiang. It's one of the most comprehensive digital surveillance and policing systems in the world. So that's been the focus of a lot of my work so far. But I'm also interested in understanding, like, how does this connect to global China projects, or is there a connection? And when you look at the marketing material from the companies that are building these systems in Xinjiang, they talk about how they see this as a space to develop new technologies that can be then deployed elsewhere. And so this spokesperson from Leon Technology is here talking about how the Belt and Road, which is China's largest development initiative, accounts for 60% of the global Muslim population. There's so many Muslims on the Belt and Road. And so because of that, the security industry in Xinjiang presents a marketing opportunity with huge and unlimited potential. And so basically what they're saying is any place where there's Muslims, they will need these technologies, because Muslims kind of in general and essentially are potential terrorists because of being Muslim. And so that's how they're framing this and how they're thinking about the need for these technologies. Now, how they're actually marketed is as part of smart or safe city systems. And this is something that's common in all cities. Toronto is also a smart and safe city, I'm sure. It's part of a worlding strategy, a way of projecting a global presence as a global city, kind of branding of the smartness of a space. In order to be a world-class city, you need to be a smart city at this point. And you can look at the work of Shannon Mattern or Jathan Sadowski to see a real careful analysis of the development and effects of smart city systems, mostly in Western contexts. It's really led by a techno-solutionism. All these companies talk about what they're building as solutions for a given problem. which is city management problems, but also counterterrorism or policing. It's important to understand that smart cities, particularly the surveillance aspects, emerge out of counterinsurgency theory. It's war theory and war technology that's now being plugged back into our spaces. That's one of the sources of smartness, is counterinsurgency, which is about mapping populations and having full spectrum intelligence of the people within the space of control. Technology does produce its own effects, but in general, what it does is mostly amplify existing social dynamics, and its primary effects are in the way that it makes governance and power of police and others scalable. And so, you can move in through multiple scales very quickly and very intimately as well. So it's tracking people, wherever they are, and there's less of an outside to this sort of a system. And then, of course, it's automated as well. So it means that there's less human labor involved, that a lot of the predictive capacity is coming from algorithms rather than from human assessment. In Canada, they talk about this, policing systems that are using these kinds of tools talk about them as being force multipliers, that it makes investigations faster, and it makes policing more systematic. They would also probably say it makes it more humane and stuff, because people won't see police on the street. Most people who are not doing anything wrong won't even know that the surveillance is happening. But of course, it is actually amplifying and accelerating problems that exist, like racialization and other things. It's also important to know that these kinds of systems require a new labor force, and they need constant maintenance. And so they don't run themselves. And that's important when we want to think about global China, because it means that Chinese technicians are often intimately involved in the running of these systems when they're moved to other places. So where are these systems? Well, a colleague of mine, Sheena Greitens, has shown that Chinese surveillance public security technology platforms are now in over 100 countries around the world. That's what she's mapping out here. And she also shows in her work that the Chinese companies are quite good at building things at the scale of a city or a country, which is different from the US or North American based or European technology companies who are more sort of site specific, like airport security and things like that. And many of these countries are using multiple forms of security at the same time, or technology from multiple places. So they're combining US or European technology with Chinese technology. The company I want to zero in on a little bit further here is the China Electronics Technology Corporation, which is the company that funded the checkpoints in Xinjiang, built the checkpoints, and also managed and serviced the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. This is the parent company of Hikvision, which is one of the world's largest camera producers. We have lots of Hikvision cameras in Canada, but most countries do as well. CETC itself is primarily a domestic military supplier, military supplier, also policing contractor. And it has direct connections with a number of the a number of the AI companies, the startups that are involved in face recognition. It was because CETC was in charge of the Olympics and in 2008, and then based on that experience, moved into more private and corporate sectors. In addition to this, one of the things I want to track is the way that where does CETC come from and how is it connected to other corporations? And so when we look at exporters of kind of integrated joint operations platforms and those sorts of things, most of that is being done by CEIEC, which I guess I don't have it's the Chinese Electronic Import Export Company. very generic. And it's basically a partner, the international partner of CETC. Both of them are connected to a parent company, which was like the original Danwei in the Maoist period, called the China Electronics Corporation. Both CETC and CEIEC have, dozens of companies that are underneath them, often as subsidiaries. And so it's difficult to track exactly how all of this moves. There's also a lot of opacity in the system. Typically, Huawei and ZTE build component parts of a CEIEC system. And that's how you see it expressed in places like Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia, Uganda, Kyrgyzstan, and a number of other countries. And so now I'm going to move into some case studies, and we're going to kind of bounce around the world to see how CEIEC companies platforms are being built in different places, and what effects they have. So one space where this is happening is in Kyrgyzstan, where CEIEC has worked with the Ministry of Internal Affairs to build face recognition camera systems and command centers for the entire country. They're also doing something similar in Tajikistan, and they've also built a kind of military base, which here it's a little bit mislabeled because they're not military. They're not People's Liberation Army people, or workers. They're actually PAP, which is People's Armed Police. And so it's actually a policing base that's extraterritorial. It's in Tajikistan, close to the border. And you see them doing a lot of training exercises and positioning themselves as trainers, but also watching the cameras. And so they're watching cameras at the border. And I think, really positioning themselves as extending the border beyond China into Central Asia. That's, I think, how we should really think about what these projects here are doing. They're policing, they're building policing and digital surveillance at the frontier of Chinese state power, extending Chinese state power, and at the same time protecting infrastructure investments. So it's less about a military force, although there's a kind of militaristic aspect to this, and more about training and assessment. It's kind of leading from behind and supporting local states. So that's one example. That's one way that these kinds of systems are being built elsewhere. Now I want to look at Cambodia. So Cambodia, is the site of around 6 million tourists from China each year. It has a lot of real estate investment and a lot of other infrastructure projects being built in Cambodia. It's also the site of a emergent authoritarian governance system. And so in 2017, we see the main newspaper that would print opposition media being banned. And we also start to see Cambodia media begin to work with Chinese journalist associations. They start a new media organization called Fresh News. And they do trainings to teach journalists how to represent China and Cambodia relationship correctly. There's a lot of Chinese media itself in the form of soap operas and reality TV that now circulates widely. It's important to know that the US does media trainings for Cambodian journalists as well, and that Facebook actually has the largest presence in Cambodia. But there is a kind of sort of beginning institutional capture that's beginning. And we also see companies like CEIEC, although I think here it's mostly Huawei, building new controls over the internet for the Cambodians, so that it's now very centralized, and so they can begin to build the kind of firewall type system that they have in China. As part of this process, we also see the opposition leaders being accused of treason and imprisoned. And we see new agreements between Chinese public security and the Cambodian Interior Ministry, and the way that they're building out all of this equipment. Hikvision and Dahua technology are really dominant in Cambodia now. And some of this really has to do with Chinese investors buying property in Cambodia and needing protection. And so of course they're going to turn or want to have Chinese surveillance systems in place to protect their investments. And this is something we see replicated in many, many places in global China. One example of that is in Ecuador. So we're moving around the globe again, where the Ecuadorian police have built a rapid response system using CIEC command centers, which you see pictured here, for the entire country. But we also see that they are mirroring that information to state security. So it's not only about rapid response to crime, it's also about control of population, and you see opposition leaders being targeted in Ecuador. The same is happening in Uganda, where another CIEC program is happening, or platform is being built along with Huawei. Huawei is involved in Ecuador too. And the way it's framed there is that the surveillance is necessary to protect the Chinese investments, the infrastructure, the roads. Here, a friend of mine, Josh Chin, is speaking to a local democracy advocate in Uganda, and she's saying that the roads need cameras. So when a new road is built by a Chinese contractor, it comes along with the cameras. And so, really what's happening here is an extension of autocratic governance or illiberal governance in these spaces, supported by this technology. And to some extent, we see a kind of institutional capture, like in the context of Cambodia, where the media system itself and internet is being sort of reshaped by Chinese state investment in data valence. Or digital analytics, and so it's combining kind of soft power, the training of media, with flexible censorship systems, digital assessment of threats, and here is probably where you see the largest sort of lean towards a neo-colonial relation, which is about capturing institutions. In other cases, it's more about utility and use in specific contexts and less about capturing institutions. All right, so that's the second kind of example of how these things play out. Now the third, I'm going to turn to Malaysia, which is the site of my future research. I was hoping to be there already, but because of COVID, I haven't been able to actually conduct this research. And so I'm really looking over the shoulder, leaning on other researchers who've done work here already. Malaysia is a site of a lot of investment, even more than Cambodia. A lot of its infrastructure, hard infrastructure like roads and pipelines and stuff like that. It's also the site of a large refugee population, primarily Rohingya folks that have fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh and then from there to Malaysia, or sometimes directly from Myanmar. There's also a significant Uyghur population there as well, people that fled over the border from China and are now in Malaysia. They sort of follow the same routes to get there. And so if we look at security projects that are being built in Kuala Lumpur, we see the refugee population being pretty directly affected by them. And Malaysia is a democratic state. It does have some authoritarian problems as well, as most democratic states do, or many do. And one of the things that is emerging out of the refugee context in Malaysia is this discourse of the fake refugee, that which would say that a lot of these Rohingya people are simply people from Bangladesh, and are here not because of a human rights crisis, but because they are poor. And so there's a threat of detention and a lot of extortion that's coming from the police, and in general, just a kind of culture of fear among this population of people, which means that they get sort of pushed into two areas of the city, in Selayang and also Ampang. and they're pushed in those directions by the surveillance systems. So there's surveillance at the heart of the city, in the high traffic areas, in the mosques, in the institutions like the hospitals and so on. And so people are being pushed into the gray economy in these two areas. Most of them are working in chicken processing or janitorial work or day labor. And so they kind of feed, clean, and build the city. And here I'm really borrowing from Shay Friedenlund's framing of this. She's a really excellent postdoc at University of Pennsylvania. So, that's one way that surveillance is happening in the space. At the same time, the UN High Commission for Refugees is also doing a surveillance project, which is a UK-based iris lock system that generates an ID for people that can prove that they are indeed refugees. And so, then you have your irises scanned, and you have this new ID that proves that you are who you are, which means that you can get other kinds of work, and you're more protected from detention or from deportation by the Malaysian authorities. But many people can't prove that they are indeed refugees. And so that means that they're just pushed to the margins, into these gray economies, these gray spaces. And so one of the things I want to focus on in my future work is the way that E2, which is doing face recognition in Xinjiang and also in Kuala Lumpur, using these body cameras at the mosques in particular, how they are affecting these populations, and also like, what does this look like from the perspective of these low-level police, which you see pictured here. And so really what's being produced here is a kind of ban Opticon, which is, here I'm taking the language of Didier Bijot, who's talking about how populations are sorted in democratic spaces. So he's looking at France, but you can see the same thing happening in North America, where undocumented immigrants, Muslim populations are controlled in specific ways by surveillance. And that changes over time, and is not the same everywhere, but it does have a similar effect, particularly in the United States, with people coming across the border, the southern border from Mexico, having to kind of flee the surveillance and stay out of the high surveillance areas and be in the gray economy. They're also butchering chickens for us, at least in the US. So there's a kind of super exploitation or devaluation of labor that's produced by the surveillance. And so this is a democratic panopticon, which is not a good outcome, but it's also different from the authoritarian governance model of surveillance and the border surveillance. And there is ways that people can use the surveillance against each other. So you see them in Malaysia using the UN card, refugee card, as a kind of protection against the other kinds of surveillance. Okay, well, I really do want to wrap up here soon so we can get to questions, but just to bring us back to Libya, and also Global China as method, so there's a film called Wolf Warrior 2, which depicts the evacuation of people from Libya back to China, and it's the most popular film of all time in China. But the idea of the wolf itself comes from an older book from the 2006 called Wolf Totem, which is about a Han person that goes to the Inner Mongolian frontier and observes how Mongol people interact with wolves to protect their sheep. And this author, Jiang Rong, says, we Chinese people, Han people, need to reclaim our wolf sort of characteristics that we've forgotten, that the Mongols still have. And instead, we need to no longer act like sheep, which he says that Confucian people act like sheep. And so this is a really popular book, a bestseller, won a bunch of prizes. And then it spawns a whole bunch of self-help books that I read when I was learning Chinese, like on the way of the wolf and stuff like that, which is, how to be a courageous person. Then comes this movie, Wolf Warrior 2, in 2017. That is, the highest grossing film of all time in China and in the world, at least in 2017. And it's depicting sort of counterterrorism as it's been deployed in Libya, and how this rogue warrior, the wolf warrior, takes on a kind of Rambo position to fill the space that's been left by the evacuation of the Americans. Like the Americans are gone, and so we need to fill the void. That's sort of the narrative of the film. And so, you do see real wolf warriors being deployed by, and that should be in scare quotes. I mean, the mercenary military being deployed in global China. A number of new security companies have popped up. A lot of them, like the Frontier Services Group, which is owned by Eric Prince, or was started by Eric Prince and is now owned by a Chinese company. A lot of them are actually, the workers themselves are international. They're not Chinese citizens. And so because they're not Chinese citizens, they're able to carry weapons, because Chinese citizens aren't permitted to have weapons if they're private citizens according to Chinese law. But there is this component. We also see military bases being built, although there's only 4 or 5 of them so far, and most of them have kind of limited capacity. It's more emergency response capacity, like this one in Djibouti. It's actually a quite small runway, and so they can't fly planes out of this, although if they do have an aircraft carrier, they could fly them from there. In any case, like the military presence of China is very, very small in comparison to the US military presence, which, there's like 800 or so, no, 750 bases around the world. And so, Chinese hard power is still pretty small in relation to US military power. But it is there. The promise is there in the film that the wolf warrior might come. But so far, the primary response really has been the deployment of security technology. And so you see back in Libya that Huawei is now building surveillance and communications infrastructure in Libya. So to conclude here, there is a dynamic of sort of learning from the global frontier and then applying it back in China, and the reverse that's happening. And so, to a certain extent, you could say behind Libya stands Xinjiang, and behind Xinjiang stands Libya. That would be one way of framing this. A lot of this is really just driven by profit. That's why they want to build these systems. But it does feed back into geopolitics. So you see that countries that have built these kinds of systems and infrastructure in addition to it, like Ecuador and so on, like they side with China at the UN, and so it's a way of sort of building a sphere of influence. In no case so far do these systems that are being built around the world have the same kind of capacity of the projects that we've seen in China, particularly in Xinjiang. They're much, much smaller. So, the project in Ecuador, for instance, is like for the entire country has 30 people watching the screens. That's just like one section of one city in Xinjiang. Xinjiang systems are much, much more complex and dense. A lot of this is, to reiterate, is profit optimization. It's about protecting geo-economic investments. And you can look at the work of C.K. Lee to see that sort of spelled out in a lot more detail. There is the extraterritorial border projects like we see in Central Asia. And then there's the propping up of autocratic governance in places like Cambodia and Ecuador. And in some cases, there's a kind of creep into institutional capture in places like Cambodia. There is also kind of the way that US tech works as well, democratic Opticon projects, and that's what we see in Malaysia. And this is kind of interwoven with the wolf warrior domestic and global soft power representations of hard power. So there's not that much Chinese hard power yet. Most of it is really the surveillance infrastructure capacity that's being built. So I'll stop there. Sorry, I went a little bit longer than I hoped. Looking forward to questions.
No, that's great. There's a ton to chew on. You've got a global scope. You've got something that you're really on the leading edge of something really fascinating, and just so many questions here. I encourage folks who want to ask a question to just type it in the Q&A. There's a button at the bottom, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. Let me start it off by just Let me ask a question that actually comes about because we're watching, Russia invade Ukraine, and we had discussions, and I count myself among the people who was involved in discussions about, Russians' weapon systems and how they work and their destructive capacity and so on and so forth. And what's been clear from the war is that, things haven't gone well, particularly, right, for the Russian military, just in a purely military sense. They still can cause plenty of damage, and tragedy ensues and so on. But I guess the point is, from a distance, things look like they're going to work very well. And do we have any evidence? Can you say anything about the effectiveness of these systems? I mean, do they work as advertised? And this gets to maybe a second question, and maybe you don't know the answer, and that's fine, because it's hard to get on the ground right now. But the second question is, how do people perceive these kinds of systems, especially, okay, Xinjiang is one thing, but outside, to the extent that we know, we've been working with talented young scholar Jasmine Delagnola, who's done some public opinion polling in Kyrgyzstan on this issue, what people think about cameras, and so and of course there's the question of whether they work or not, and then there's the question of what people assume that they're doing, because and it gets to questions of not just the legitimacy of, let's say, a Chinese company involved in tech, but also of your own state. Do you trust what your state is telling you, what the government is telling you about whatever, data protection, privacy protections, about oversight, about all of these different kinds of things? So the first question is about, do they work? And the second question is, even if they don't work, do they do some kind of political, work in terms of the perceptions of the general public? Any thoughts on those?
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose do they work depends on what you mean by working, or how people want, like, what they've been advertised to do, and if they're meeting the parameters of that or not. So let's take the Ecuador example, for instance. Like, it's a kind of 911 system is how it's framed. Like, that was the purpose for building it. And it does scan the city and then the country in real time, and in cases where they're using face recognition stuff and they have watch lists in place, like, it will recognize people, I suppose. But you see that the way they've deployed it is in a way that the cameras are in wealthy neighborhoods. They're positioned right outside of the political opposition leader's home. They're mirrored to state security. So it's pretty clear that, like, part of the goal of the system was to control democratic opposition. And so if that was why it was built, then it is probably working, because it's controlling where that people that are being watched can move, and chilling speech, I suppose, and chilling movement. So in that sense it works, but it's so I guess there's the kind of the advertising or kind of public facing, that this is about security work, this is about policing, and I don't know if it does that effectively. Some of this tech is pretty new. I mean, most of it is. It's 5-10 years old in terms of, like, it being built out at scale, and it's still being fine-tuned, and so it doesn't have quite the capacity that it may down the line. In the Xinjiang case, like, it is quite sophisticated and accurate when it comes to scanning and recognizing people. Like, it has 96% probability ratings and stuff like that. When a person runs in front of the camera, like, it figures out who they are really quickly. And so there's the potential for it to be very, have a lot of capacity. I can't say if it does for sure yet. In terms of how people perceive it, that's probably the more effective part of it. It produces self-discipline. It pushes people to act in different ways, sometimes to just stay out of the gaze of the camera altogether if they're in a really precarious position. And so that, control of movement is effective, but it's more of a political or secondary effect of the threat of the technology, and also the opacity of it. You don't really know what the capacity of the systems are, and so you think it might be watching or listening to you, and you start to control your behavior. It also really depends on the positioning of the person or people. So if you think that the government and the state is there to protect you, and if you're a wealthy person from the sort of protected middle class, it might be fine for you. Like you'd say, like, I haven't done anything wrong. It's just here to make my neighborhood safer. But people that are criminalized or racialized in a state, they're going to feel quite differently about that. So I guess the answer is it's complicated and depends on the context and who you are.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I'm actually just finished reading a dissertation. I don't know if because it's not published, I'm not sure if I can talk about who it is, but I'll just say that it offers a slight twist on your account. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, but the account is basically about Chinese policing over the years and looking at the kind of new wave of technologies as, of course, technologically innovative and therefore more penetrative and all of this kind of stuff. But the essential style of policing, right, designating so-called target peoples, people who are likely to, or in the estimation of the party state, likely to become troublemakers, right, for the party state down the road. And so what did you call it? So that's data analytics, but in a way, the data analytics preceded, the data analytic approach preceded the sort of technologies that we're now talking about. And so at least for this dissertation, it's not necessarily the war on terror that spurred it, that there's something sort of in the, Chinese Communist Party way of policing that sort of leads in this direction already. But I did want to ask you, so, I mean, you mentioned here and there capitalism, and I want to hear more about that story, but I also want to hear about the state in general, right? Because we know, and of course, these two accounts again can be complementary, but the high modern state, if we're following Jim Scott, is all about legibility in the first place. It's all about, and this is just the pinnacle, or I guess we can maybe get higher, I don't know. But this seems to have elevated the legibility of the population to new kinds of levels, right? And it almost seems like you can combine legibility with mobility, which is, required by modern capitalism, right? So you can have people move, but where they are, or I guess the algorithms can predict what they're about to do, right? Is the conceit there. So to what extent is it a story about capitalism in general? To what extent is this a story about the state? I mean, how do you think through these different things?
Mm-hmm. Well, it is all of those things. And just to start with your first comment about how this is preceded by older systems. Yeah, of course, like the dossier system was there before. It's been digitized and made more intimate and scalable. And so in general, these kinds of technology systems amplify and extend, existing systems. They make them worse if they're bad. Not too often do they make them better, I don't think. I think surveillance in general has it's focused on control. When it comes to dealing with a pandemic, there is some reasons why you'd want to track disease and things like that. But in general, I think surveillance is something we should really be critical of and think carefully about. In terms of the state and capitalism, so China is both a kind of neoliberal economy and a illiberal economy. It's a production-centered economy and a consumption-centered economy. A lot of discussion of surveillance capitalism is focused on the consumption side, about how Facebook wants to target us with advertising. That's why they're looking at our data. What I see in China is that it's being used in the smart factory, or in the deciding about who should be a worker in what place and where they're allowed to go. And so because of the older systems of hukou, which is household registration, and migrant labor in China, those logics are being twisted and turned to support this new policing initiative in Xinjiang and put Uyghurs to work in these securitized, surveilled factories. And so you can think about Amazon warehouses as the other side of the production economy in the West, and how surveillance is used there, where it's biometrics and like making sure that you're not taking too many bathroom breaks and stuff. it's working on both sides for the economy. It's also really propping up well, maybe not propping up, but it's extending the state power of the Chinese Communist Party. It's making their power more intimate, and it's chilling, free speech, of course, even stopping the speech before it happens, I think. That's been there for a long time, but I think it's becoming more intimate. It's becoming more difficult to escape the system. Like before, people could get a VPN. Now the state knows if you have a VPN, and they're going to target you because of it. So like it's harder to sort of step outside of the system. And so that's the danger. And you see this happening in many places. I mean, in Russia, they're checking people's phones now too, to make sure that they don't have banned apps on there. And it's not only Russia, it's also in Egypt, it's also in Belarus. It's a whole bunch of places where phones are now being tracked by the state. And so, the digital footprints we leave behind, we don't think about it because we're probably in the protected position. But those that are vulnerable or made vulnerable by a state, like they can now be really tightly controlled because we've shared so much information with the world on the internet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So a lot of these sort of lead to some of the questions that are in the that have come in so far, and you've alluded on some of these things here and there, but Amazon, Facebook, and so on. But there's a question about does the U.S. and do the U.S. and Western Europe have similar competitive technologies? And let me add to that question. Does their use play itself out differently, and if so, why, or is it similar on some kind of level?
Mm-hmm. I think it is quite similar, and there's direct sort of knowledge sharing and sometimes collaboration that's happening as well. So like the internal police database that was used is used in the Integrated Joint Operations Platform was built in part using Oracle software, which is a Texas-based firm. They were using the freeware version of it, which is, anyone can download it. And there's a kind of culture in Silicon Valley of open source. You build something and you have like the paid version and you have the free version. And the free version is supposed to get you started as a customer, and then you can build your market share that way. And so, there's the integration that's happening at the level of the tech. Then there's also the ways that they mirror strategy and kind of reverse engineer stuff. So Palantir, which is a company that was started by Peter Thiel, who is the founder of PayPal, and is still quite closely connected to the U.S. government and is working with Canadian police as well. That system, Palantir, is meant to do sort of integrated joint operations stuff, which is integrating these different data streams, doing scraping of data from Facebook and other social media to build portraits of potential criminals. So it's used after the fact for criminal investigation primarily, or at least that's what the police say it's used for. Part of the issue here is we're depending on the police's discretionary power. They're kind of an executive power. They're violence workers. They're there to sort of, project state power, law enforcement, I suppose. But there's a lot of discretion that's available to them in terms of what they can do. And so, building these kinds of powerful tools is giving, it is a force multiplier. That's what they say it is, the police. But it's really extending their power, and we should be thinking carefully about that. In general, the ways in which these things work differently is just based on the legal systems that prevent abuse of them. And so far, there's not a lot of legal protections, even in the West. Some of that's because the tech is so new, and some of it is because the tech is so powerful and wealthy. I mean, these companies have a lot of funding and a lot of political support, kind of connected to that. So, yeah, I wish I could say that US-based tech or built tech acts differently, but I don't know that it really does that much. It's more about the political usage that it's put to in a given context. It could be used in very similar ways. And when I talk to people at Tencent, like the companies in China who are building some of this stuff, that's what they say too. They say, like, why are you coming after us? We're just doing the same thing that the US companies are doing, and we're doing it, in our legal system.
No, that's fair. I mean, I guess in the West, there's the possibility, though this is hardly a guarantee, of backlash against, the abuse of the technology. I mean, it becomes a political question of the appetite of society to protect rights, if we think that rights are worth protecting, right? Ask your average 14-year-old, the one who's on the other side of the door here, and they're like, yeah, rights. No, there's a generational shift, which a sort of technophilia, which is makes it harder to assume that a backlash would be forthcoming if these technologies are in fact abused by our legal standards, right? But nonetheless, I think there is some kind of a difference there. And just, you mentioned the smart city thing. Toronto, at last check, has abandoned the smart city thing that Google or one of Google's companies was working on, Sidewalk Labs or something like that.
Right.
So
and that's absolutely true.
That's a story of backlash.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So like there is the check that comes from media and also from worker organizing. Tech won't build it is a movement in Silicon Valley and Seattle, where they're saying we're going to quit this company if you continue to contract with the state. And Black Lives Matter protest and so on has put a lot of pressure on companies to stop supporting police face recognition systems. So there is that is a major difference. When it comes to the tech itself, I think it's similar in its programming, I suppose, but there is the possibility to push back.
That's fair. Okay, to a couple of other questions here. Let me just ask a couple at a time now. I guess in a way this is a different kind of backlash. Somebody asks, are the systems subject to cyber attacks? Right. We're going to put our faith in hacktivists and so on. So that's one question. And then there's another question about, I assume this is referring to Chinese systems. Are Chinese systems used in Canada? I think you mentioned, and which companies are involved? And I guess, related to that, and this is my addition here, a lot of these technologies are, borrow something from military, they're dual use, right? I mean, yes, they can be used for surveillance in a way that goes beyond what is normatively acceptable or legally acceptable. But we can also think about uses that they might be put to that would be perfectly within the bounds of law or existing norms and so on. So which of course is the heart of the, is there a problem necessarily with Chinese systems being used on Canadian territory?
Right. Okay, so maybe I'll start with that, the Canadian question, and then move to the other ones, reversing the gaze. So yes, there are Chinese companies that are working in Canada. Dahua, Hikvision are here for sure. And iFlyTech, which is doing voice recognition. You can buy their products on Amazon.ca for sure. Most of these companies, many of them have some subsidiary or some direct sales in Canada. And some of this is for the private market, and some of it is state contracted or institutional contracting, like at the university level, that sort of thing. It's the cheapest often game in town, and it's also very competitive with Japanese or US made equipment, and so that's a lot of why people choose it. And so should we be concerned if Huawei is here or Hikvision? I mean, potentially, I suppose, because there's backdoors that could be there, and it could open it up to Chinese state security potentially. But US built stuff can do that too. And we've agreed, I think, in Canada to work with US state security. So we've kind of given that away already. I think really ultimately the primary object of critique should be the systems themselves, the technologies themselves, rather than who's built them. I don't see that much of a difference between a Palantir system and a CETC system in terms of how it can be used by the police. And mostly, I think the Chinese state isn't interested in the data itself. They're interested in having diplomatic power, a sphere of influence that can come through these kinds of information sharing. It's sort of similar, I would say, to the way that Israelis are selling their equipment to all kinds of countries as a way of sort of leveraging diplomatic and international power, less than I think about Israeli surveillance wanting to collect data from other places. In general, these things should be opposed. That's my answer, I suppose. The other question about, can this be subject to cyber attack? Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that has made my work possible. Like, to have hundreds of thousands of internal police documents be given to me by the Intercept, who got, because PSB in Xinjiang was working with a state contractor and they weren't really protecting their data, it meant that it was, we were able to get it. And so you can kind of evaluate these things in real time in a way that wouldn't be possible in an earlier moment of kind of mass incarceration or internment. So, there's a banality of evil of data and statistics being used in Germany in World War II. But that's paper on pen, and you can get access to that information eventually, but it's not going to happen in real time, and so you can't amplify it and sort of stop it while it's happening, or at least make the world aware of it as it's happening in quite the same way. And so the kind of reversal of the gaze, which the fancier term is surveillance, is something that's available when you're working with digital technology, and you see that being used in protests. That you see that in Ukraine, how social media is being mobilized to document in real time what's happening on the ground and make it just an undeniable truth to the world that this is happening. That is using digital technology in a really powerful way. And so it does have dual use, of course. It's really important for democratic movement and movements and for knowledge production. But it can also be used in really harmful ways by the state. And that's the dynamic that I'm really interested in, actually. I got started thinking about how Uyghurs are using digital technology to build kind of a cultural efflorescence in the early 2010s. And then I started to realize, oh, the state is going to use that material to track everyone and decide who should be detained. And so then it became more about surveillance rather than sort of the flourishing of the promise of technology. But the promise is still there. We just need to have more regulation, and we need better design of the tech, I think, to prevent this sort of harmful or oppressive tech.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, it does get to, I guess, human social institutions that might they don't disappear just because we're talking about tech, right? And the role that tech plays is at the interface of the kinds of norms and institutions and patterns of behavior, whether it's oversight or protections on the use of data, and these kinds of things are, and we of course have to think about what that looks like in an era of instant communication and infinite dissemination of data. So obviously these are the dilemmas. Couple more quick questions, and then maybe you can use these to wrap up. Any thoughts or anything else that you sort of want to add? Could you comment on the Russia-China cooperation in security and surveillance? And if so, how profound is this cooperation? And maybe related, I don't know, are there known cases when China has used technologies for spying in Western countries, right? I mean, we all know about the possibility of spying, the concern about spying. We know about the back door that as you sort of mentioned, but I mean, are there known cases where this has actually occurred? And then let me throw in my last one as well, just to make sure your plate is totally full as we head into this last round of comments. what if China really is behaving like Israel in this sense, right? Okay, domestically, we have a horrifying story in Xinjiang, right? To me, okay, that's entirely clear. But what if the responsibility for how tech is used or abused is, in fact, lies with the Kyrgyz government, the Ecuadorian government, right? It's not really a story. Yes, China's trying to extend its reach, but maybe it can extend its reach, as you started to, I think, hint at, without necessarily exporting an authoritarian model. I mean, technology is dual use, can do lots of different things, or maybe it leans authoritarian, but it doesn't guarantee anything. And so is there any space for us to be thinking about the responsibility of, the receiving country, the Malaysias and so on, um, uh, for their use of these kinds of new technological innovations? So any thoughts on all of these things, and then we'll wrap up.
Mm-hmm. Oh, those are great questions. So I'll start with the Russia-China cooperation question. Certainly when it comes to weapons or security technology, they lean in the direction of China, and that's, I think, because they're so suspicious of non-Chinese or non-aligned tech, that it could be used for spying, that there could be backdoors in it, and there could be. They're not, they're not wrong in thinking that way. I would, if I was Russia, I wouldn't necessarily want a US state contractor to be building my tech, if you're viewing the US as an adversary. So I think that's a lot of it. It's sort of pragmatic. And also the price, I think, is there. It's the price point issue is an important one for a lot of states, especially middle income states, or developing states. I think going forward, as Russia is more isolated, I think the China-Russia relationship will become even stronger, most likely. And I think that's one of the reasons why China has viewed, or has been reluctant to take a very strong stance on the Russia invasion of Ukraine. I mean, they've sort of supported it in some ways, not so vocally, but they're sort of holding back. And I think they see themselves as, if they don't have Russia, they'd be even more isolated. And so they see Russia as a strategic partner, even if they disagree perhaps with, some of the Russian foreign policy. I mean, India is sort of in a similar position relative to Russia too. It's just too much of a strategic partner to denounce. I don't know enough about specific tech that in the Russia-China relationship. One space to look at, though, is in fintech or financial technology, because so much, like Apple Pay and other forms, the Swift bank system, they're no longer available to Russians. And so I think we'll see them moving towards Alipay or WeChat Pay, those sorts of things, which, would be a challenge. I mean, there have to be some development work done, because so far you need to have a Chinese bank account to work those systems. And so China would need to, make exceptions or develop a new tool to help, Russian consumers use those financial services. But I would see that as a development space for Chinese developers. In terms of the second question, is there examples of China spying in Western countries? So I see in the internal police database that they're using Facebook and other social media platforms to assess problematic populations of Uyghurs living in Turkey, for instance. They're looking at people's images and drawing associations based on those images. But that's open source scraping data from Facebook. And so it's not Facebook cooperating with the Chinese state to make that happen. It's doing similar things to what Palantir does, which is scrape data in the same way. So that's, I think, the primary way that China would collect data on people, rather than the more kind of direct spying. Although if you use WeChat on your phone, my sense, from talking with people that work in tech in Silicon Valley, that work at Apple, that means that your phone is now kind of available to the Chinese state security in a lot of different ways, in terms of the access that they'll have to your social messaging, your contact list, your microphone, your camera. And so, you know, if you're using some Chinese tech, like WeChat, you know, be aware that that's a possibility. I think, though, that it's not in general, like that everyone who has WeChat on their phone is having that happen to them. I think you have to be a targeted person, and then it's used more strategically. So it's you know, something similar to the way that the Pegasus system that's developed by the Israelis does that work, although they do it without having to have an app at all. So that's, I think, how the state of it. Of course, going forward, I'm sure that there's Chinese tech people that are working on a Pegasus equivalent, so they can be able to do the sort of thing that the Israelis are doing. But I haven't seen evidence that they're there yet. The third question, which is like, where does responsibility lie? I think it does rely with the receiving governments in terms of how this tech is used and deployed. So I've kind of said that I think surveillance in general is a pernicious form of technology, and that it has a certain logic to it that targets vulnerable people. But there's, worse and better forms of targeting. There's more protections that can be built into these systems, more forms of privacy, and it can be used to stop crime and things like that. So, I think the onus really relies on those that have the technology and are using it. And like in Malaysia, they're saying like, there's basically no critique of security, that all security is good. And so like, of course you want to have face recognition at the entrance to the mosque, because there could be terrorists or whatever. And they're not thinking at all from the position of the people that are, harmed by that kind of surveillance. And so we need policymakers who are thinking from that position, and we need, grassroots movements that help amplify the position of the vulnerable to make people aware of it. So there's lots of work to do. And I think, it's the receiving companies or countries and Chinese state actors, all bear responsibility.
Wow, you've covered an incredible amount of ground, and on the topic that's, of course, very much in the news, of concern. But I know from your previous work and from your training as a sociocultural anthropologist that you're going to do it with a great attention to how it affects ordinary people. And so that's one of the things that is really exciting. I can't wait to see the publications that come from this work as it develops. And we've done a great tour this Friday afternoon, or what is it? What time is it in Vancouver? Okay, a little earlier in the afternoon there, but apologies to those who posed questions and I wasn't able to get to them, but we're out of time. So Darren, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in Toronto or somewhere else before too long.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
No, it's great, and it speaks directly to our Belt and Road project here at the Monk School, and so we're really delighted to have you. All best to everybody in the audience, and have a terrific weekend. Darren, take care.
Bye.
Bye.